The millionaire's mother bought a drink from a young girl's stall at a fair when she suddenly collapsed and had to be rushed to the emergency room. However, a few days later, after recovering, the old mother quickly apologized to the girl. The fairground pulsed with life, the scent of grilled meat and sweet caramel swirling together beneath a canopy of glowing lanterns. Children ran past in bursts of laughter, sticky fingers clutching oversized cotton candy. Vendors called out, advertising everything from handcrafted jewelry to deep-fried indulgences that crackled in hot oil. Hayley adjusted the strap of her purse and sighed, shifting uncomfortably as her mother practically beamed beside her. "I don't know why you insist on dragging me to these things," Hayley muttered, dodging a teenager carrying an absurdly large stuffed bear. "Oh, stop being so stiff," Barbara chided, patting her daughter's arm. "You used to love the fair when you were little." "Yeah, when I was 8. Hayley rolled her eyes, but allowed her mother to tug her forward. Barbara's steps were light, carrying her with the ease of someone who belonged here, among the hum of conversation and flashing carnival rides. Hayley, on the other hand, felt like she stuck out, a corporate woman in a crisp blouse, heels clicking against the uneven pavement, while her mother wove through the crowd with the confidence of a seasoned fairgoer. Then, Barbara stopped short, her eyes lighting up at a small drink stand tucked between a popcorn stall and a booth selling wooden crafts. The stand was modest but charming, wooden countertops, glass bottles filled with colorful syrups, and a chalkboard sign listing drinks with neat handwriting. Behind it, a young woman worked swiftly, pouring and shaking with practiced ease. Sarah. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, a few strands falling over her forehead as she handed a cup to a customer. There was something natural about the way she moved, like she had been doing this her whole life, like she belonged here, as much as the scent of roasting chestnuts in the air. Barbara stepped forward, eyes scanning the menu. "Oh, this one looks interesting. What's your specialty, dear?" Sarah glanced up, flashing an easy smile. "That'd be the house blend. It's got a bit of a nutty sweetness, but really smooth. People seem to love it." Barbara nodded approvingly. "That sounds perfect. I'll take one." Hayley folded her arms, unimpressed. "Mum, you don't even know what's in it." Barbara waved her off. "That's the fun of it, isn't it?" Sarah chuckled, already moving to prepare the drink. She worked with fluidity, her fingers tapping lightly against the glass as she poured, the faintest trace of concentration furrowing her brow. The ice clinked against the sides, the liquid swirling into a rich caramel hue before she topped it with a delicate sprinkle of something fine and powdery. "There you go." Sarah slid the drink across the counter. "Hope you like it." Barbara took a sip, her eyes brightening. "Oh, this is wonderful. Just the right amount of sweetness." Sarah grinned. "Glad to hear it." Hayley checked her watch, ready to move on, but her mother took another sip, clearly content to linger. And then, a sharp gasp. Barbara's fingers twitched. The cup tumbled from her grasp, landing with a dull splash against the pavement. Her body stiffened before she staggered, clutching at her throat. "Mum?" Hayley's voice shot up, the casual irritation in her tone vanishing in an instant. "Mum? What's wrong?" Barbara's breaths came in short, labored gulps, her eyes wide with alarm. The world around them slowed, sound fading under the weight of the moment. Sarah's stomach twisted. She's having a reaction." The words barely left her mouth before she was moving, reaching for her phone with one hand, while the other steadied Barbara. "Call an ambulance," she barked at a bystander who stood frozen in shock. "Now!" The man jolted into action, fumbling for his phone, while Hayley tried to support Barbara, her voice breaking as she pleaded, "Stay with me, Mum. Please, just hold on." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she turned to her stall, scanning the menu she had handwritten herself. Pistachios. It was right there, clearly listed. But Barbara, had she not seen it? Did she not know? A low, ragged gasp snapped Sarah's focus back. Barbara's knees buckled. Sarah grabbed a clean towel kneeling beside her. Just breathe, okay? Help is on the way. She wasn't sure who she was trying to reassure, Barbara, Haley, or herself. The flashing lights of the approaching ambulance cut through the night, and within moments, paramedics were swarming the scene. Haley clung to her mother's hand as they lifted her onto the stretcher, her breaths shallow, her body trembling with the weight of fear. Sarah didn't move. She wanted to. She should pack up her stall, pretend this never happened, let it become someone else's burden. But instead, she swallowed hard and stepped forward. "I'm coming with you." Haley whipped around, her eyes burning with accusation. "Haven't you done enough?" The words hit like a slap, but Sarah stood her ground. "I didn't do anything wrong. And if I did, I want to know." The paramedics didn't argue, too focused on stabilizing Barbara. The siren wailed as the ambulance doors shut, taking Haley and Barbara inside. Sarah followed close behind, her pulse hammering against her ribs. If this was her fault, she needed to know. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the waiting room, making everything feel colder than it already was. A vending machine hummed quietly in the corner, its neon buttons flickering, offering snacks that no one had the appetite for. Nurses moved briskly through the hallways, their rubber-soled shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. Haley sat stiffly on one of the plastic chairs, her arms crossed so tightly across her chest that her nails dug into her forearms. Her foot tapped against the tile, a steady, nervous rhythm that filled the silence between them. Sarah stood a few feet away, hands clasped in front of her, head slightly bowed, not in guilt, but in sheer exhaustion. "Are you just going to stand there?" Haley's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and brittle. Sarah exhaled slowly, lifting her head. "I don't know what else to do," she admitted. Her voice was even, but her fingers twitched slightly, betraying the weight pressing down on her. "You could start by telling me what the hell was in that drink," Haley snapped. Sarah straightened, her jaw tightening. "I already told you. There was nothing wrong with it. I list every ingredient. I prepare everything fresh. I don't." Haley shot up from her seat, her hands curling into fists. "Then why is my mother fighting for her life?" A murmur rippled through the other waiting families, subtle but unmistakable. Heads turned, eyes darted between them. Some looked at Haley with sympathy, others at Sarah with curiosity, maybe even suspicion. Sarah swallowed. Haley." The voice was deep, steady, a sudden anchor in a room tilting dangerously off balance. Both women turned as Thomas stepped in, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakably commanding. His tie was slightly loosened, the sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled up just enough to show the tension in his forearms. He had come straight from wherever he had been, and yet nothing about him seemed rushed. Haley turned toward him, relief flickering in her features before frustration took its place. "Thomas, thank God, you need to do something. This woman—" She gestured sharply at Sarah. "Could have killed Mom." Thomas exhaled through his nose, stepping forward. "Let's hear the doctor out first," he said simply. His tone left no room for argument. Sarah kept her gaze on him, watching, measuring. Unlike Haley, his anger wasn't explosive. It was controlled, calculating. That, somehow, made it worse. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. No one spoke. Even Haley, who had been brimming with fury, was reduced to pacing, arms still crossed. Thomas remained seated, one hand on his knee, fingers tapping lightly, barely perceptible. Sarah stayed standing, shifting her weight from one foot to another, stealing glances at the hallway where the doctor would emerge. And then, finally, the door swung open. A middle-aged man in a lab coat stepped out, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he scanned the room. Family of Barbara Williams. Haley was on him in seconds. Is she okay? The doctor nodded, flipping through his chart. She's stable now. The reaction was severe, but the medication worked. She's resting. A collective exhale. Haley slumped slightly in relief, one hand coming up to press against her temple. But then, she turned back towards Sarah, her eyes narrowing again. Reaction, she repeated. To what? The doctor adjusted his glasses. Pistachios. She had an undiagnosed allergy. It was lucky we caught it in time. Sarah blinked, her stomach lurched. Pistachios, her drink. She had listed it. It was right there, in clear print on the chalkboard. She had never hidden it. Never. She let out a slow breath. I write all the ingredients out, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Haley crossed her arms tighter, her relief already morphing back into suspicion. And you didn't think to say it out loud. Sarah lifted her gaze. It's on the menu, she said evenly. Haley scoffed. Do you seriously think every single customer memorizes every single ingredient? Mom is older. She probably didn't even see it. Sarah clenched her jaw, biting back everything she wanted to say, about personal responsibility, about the impossibility of warning every single person about something clearly written. But she didn't. Not here. She stopped, pressing her lips together. Then finally, I'm sorry. It was the easiest way to let it go. Haley looked as if she wanted to argue, to rip into her again, but Thomas placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Enough. But Thomas... Enough, he repeated. His voice was quiet, but it held weight. Haley let out an exasperated sigh, but finally dropped into her seat. Thomas turned to Sarah, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke. I apologize for my sister. Sarah nodded once, arms crossing over herself, not in defense, but as if bracing against the weight of the entire night. A nurse poked her head into the waiting room. You can see her now. Haley immediately moved toward the hallway, but before following, she cast one last glare in Sarah's direction. Sarah didn't move, didn't say a word. The waiting room had emptied out considerably. The hush of the hospital at night was different from the chaos of earlier, quieter, heavier. The vending machine still hummed in the corner, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. Thomas stood near the doorway, his hands in his pockets, watching Haley disappear down the hallway. She hadn't looked back, and he hadn't expected her to. He let out a quiet breath before turning to Sarah. Wait here, he said, voice low but firm. Sarah barely moved, exhaustion pressing down on her limbs. She had no reason to follow orders from this man, yet she nodded. She had no fight left in her tonight. Thomas strode into the hall, his polished shoes clicking softly against the linoleum. He found Haley standing just outside their mother's room, arms still wrapped around herself. Text me when she wakes up, he said, keeping his voice steady. Haley exhaled sharply. Where are you going? I'm taking Sarah home. Haley's brows furrowed. Why? She can find her own way. Because it's the right thing to do. Haley scoffed, shaking her head. You're too soft, Thomas. He didn't argue, just gave her one last glance before turning away. Back in the waiting room, Sarah was exactly where he left her, still standing, still small under the fluorescent lights. Come on, he said, already heading for the exit. Sarah hesitated, arms still crossed tightly over her chest. I can call a cab. Thomas paused at the doorway, turning slightly. I'd rather you didn't. His voice wasn't demanding, but there was a certainty to it that left no room for argument. Sarah exhaled through her nose, then, without a word, followed him outside. The parking lot was quiet, the cool night air a relief after the stale sterility of the hospital. Thomas unlocked his sleek black car with a beep, and Sarah slid into the passenger seat hesitantly, hands folding in her lap. The moment the door shut, silence wrapped around them like a second skin. Thomas started the engine. His grip on the wheel relaxed, but his movements precise. Sarah stared out the window, watching streetlights pass in rhythmic patterns, the city glowing dimly under the late hour. For a while, neither spoke. She didn't know what to say, and Thomas wasn't the type to fill silence for the sake of it. It wasn't until they reached a stoplight that he finally broke it. "How long have you been running that stand?" Sarah turned her head slightly, surprised. He still looked ahead, focused on the road, but there was something in his tone, not just politeness, but genuine curiosity. "A few years," she said finally. "Started with small events, then fairs, markets, wherever they'll let me set up." The light turned green, and the car moved forward smoothly. "You like it?" Sarah blinked at the question. It wasn't one she got often. Most people either dismissed her work as unimportant or pitied her for it. "Yeah," she said slowly. "I do." Thomas hummed, as if considering that answer. Sarah glanced at him. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged slightly, keeping one hand on the wheel. "Just trying to understand." She frowned. "Understand what?" His jaw shifted, as if debating whether to answer. Then, finally, why someone fights so hard for something most people overlook. Sarah scoffed lightly, looking back out the window. Not everyone can afford to overlook things. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fair enough." The words sat between them, heavier than they should have been. For the first time, Sarah really looked at him, not just as the rich man defending his sister, not just as someone who had the power to make things easier or harder for her. She saw him, a man who carried himself with ease, but not arrogance. Someone who measured his words carefully. Someone who, despite everything, wasn't as unreachable as she'd assumed. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who goes to fairs," she said, breaking the silence. A corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I don't." "Then why were you there?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was quieter. "Mum likes them." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "And Haley?" Thomas let out a quiet chuckle. "Hates them. She only went because Mum wanted to." Sarah smirked. "I could tell." Thomas shook his head, amusement flickering across his face before fading into something unreadable. Silence stretched again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. Sarah rested her head against the window, exhaustion creeping in. The night had drained her, and for the first time since everything had started, she allowed herself to relax. When Thomas pulled up near the now empty fairgrounds, she let out a slow breath. The bright lights were gone, replaced by the soft glow of street lamps. It was strange seeing it like this, quiet, almost ghostly. Sarah reached for the door handle. "Thanks for the ride." Thomas didn't respond immediately. She turned back, finding him watching her, not intently, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but like he was seeing something for the first time. "Here is my business card. It has my phone number on it. Please call me if needed." Thomas didn't know when he had pulled out a business card from his wallet and handed it to Sarah as he spoke. Sarah raised a brow. "Oh, you are a boss." She glanced at the business card and smiled slightly. A slow nod. She considered him, considered the night, considered how much had happened in the last few hours. Then she shook her head with a small smile. I think I'll be fine." Thomas didn't argue, just gave a slight nod. She stepped out, the night air wrapping around her again. As she walked toward the remains of the fair, she had the strangest feeling. She was being watched, not in a threatening way, not in a way that unsettled her. She turned her head slightly, catching the faint outline of Thomas still sitting in his car, watching her through the windshield. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't wave, just kept walking. And inside the car, Thomas stayed parked for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the space she had disappeared into. His phone buzzed on the console. Haley's name lit up the screen. He answered, his voice steady. "Yeah? Mum's awake." Thomas exhaled. "I'm on my way." And finally, he pulled away. The city never truly slept, but late at night, it slowed. The streets, once bursting with hurried steps and impatient horns, stretched emptily under flickering streetlights. Neon signs hummed, casting distorted reflections on the damp pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, fading as it turned down another street. Thomas sat in his car, parked in front of his building, the key still in the ignition. He hadn't gone inside yet, hadn't moved since he got in. He should have been exhausted. The weight of the evening still sat heavy on his chest. His mother's collapse, Haley's anger, the tension coiling tight in his shoulders. But none of that was what kept him awake. It was her. Sarah. She lingered in the back of his mind, slipping into thoughts where she had no place. The way she had stood in the hospital, quiet but unyielding. The way she had clasped her hands together, like she was keeping herself from shaking. The way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with deference, but with something else entirely. Resentment? Maybe. Curiosity? Definitely. He let out a slow breath, tilting his head back against the seat. It didn't make sense. She wasn't the first person he'd ever encountered who wasn't impressed by his name. Wasn't the first person to push back instead of leaning in. But something about Sarah was different. Forget it. He turned the key, shutting off the engine, pushed the door open, stepped into the dimly lit lobby of his building. He had things to do, responsibilities. He wasn't going to waste his time chasing after someone who had already made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. Days passed. He told himself he wasn't thinking about her. But that was a lie. The thought came in quiet moments, when he was in a meeting and his mind drifted, when he caught himself scanning the faces in a crowd, when he stopped by a coffee shop and wondered how different her drinks might taste. And then, one sunset afternoon, he gave in. It was late when he found himself driving down familiar streets, turning onto the road leading to the fairgrounds. The place was almost unrecognizable now. Where there had been laughter and music, there was only silence. The rides were gone, the booths dismantled. The space felt hollow, like the remnants of a dream that had faded upon waking. He sat there, staring at the empty lot, gripping the wheel harder than necessary. She was gone. He should have known she wouldn't stay in one place. Frustration curled in his chest, though he couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't like he had any right to be irritated. He had never asked for her number, had never given her his, had let her walk away that night without a word. What had he expected? That fate would be kind? That somehow she'd just appear again? He shook his head at his own foolishness and pulled away from the curb. He needed a cigarette. The convenience store was quiet, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and plastic-wrapped sandwiches. The cashier barely looked up from her phone as Thomas stepped inside. He made his way to the back, scanning the rows of cigarettes, when movement in his peripheral vision made him pause. And there she was, Sarah, standing in the aisle, holding a carton of eggs, studying the expiration date, like the fate of the world depended on it. For a second, he thought he had imagined her, but then she looked up, saw him, and smiled. Not surprised, not awkward, just amused. "Well," she said, closing the fridge door, "if it isn't my chauffeur." Thomas let out a quiet exhale, shaking his head as he grabbed a pack of cigarettes from the shelf. "I don't remember signing up for that job," he said, voice even. Sarah tucked the eggs into her basket. "Funny, I don't remember asking for a ride either." A beat. Then his lips twitched, just slightly. Sarah's grin widened like she had won something. She glanced at his hand. "Didn't peg you for a smoker." "I don't," he admitted. "Just needed an excuse to step out." Sarah arched a brow, shifting the basket to her other hand. "Rough day." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that." She studied him for a second, then shrugged. "I get it." He found himself watching her, how easily she moved, how she didn't try to fill the silence with empty conversation. Then, casually, she said, "I was about to make dinner. If you're hungry, you could join me." Thomas blinked, caught off guard. It wasn't an invitation laced with expectation. There was no hesitation in her tone, no attempt to soften it into something palatable. Just a simple offer, like it didn't matter whether he accepted or not. And yet, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself saying, "Yeah, okay." Sarah gave a small nod, as if that settled it. Then, without waiting for him, she turned toward the checkout. Thomas exhaled, shaking his head slightly before following her. Fate, it seemed, had been kind after all. The apartment was smaller than he expected, but there was something about it that made Thomas hesitate at the doorway. It wasn't the size. It was the warmth. The space felt lived in. Not polished, not curated, but real. A worn-out couch sat against the far wall, a pile of books teetering on the armrest. The curtains weren't a matching set, and the small wooden table in the center of the room bore scratches from years of use. A string of dim fairy lights hung unevenly near the window, casting a soft golden glow over everything. Sarah kicked off her shoes by the door, tossing her bag onto the couch. "Make yourself at home." Thomas, out of habit, reached up to loosen his tie before realizing he wasn't wearing one. He stepped inside, taking in the space. It smelled faintly of citrus and something floral, not artificial, just familiar. "You always invite strangers over for dinner?" he asked, watching as she set her grocery bag on the counter. Sarah shot him a look, amused. "Only the ones who give me free rides." A beat. Then his lips twitched. "Good to know." She grinned before rolling up the sleeves of her sweater. "Hope you're okay with something simple. I'm not a chef." Thomas leaned against the counter, watching as she pulled out ingredients with practiced ease. "I don't mind." Sarah opened the fridge, pulling out a few vegetables, a couple of eggs. "If you're feeling useful, you can chop these." She placed a cutting board and a knife in front of him. Thomas glanced at the knife, then at her. "That's a terrible idea." Sarah's lips quirked. "What? Afraid you'll ruin my masterpiece?" "Number, I just don't think I've chopped anything in years," she snorted. "What? Your money does that for you?" He raised a brow. "Something like that." Sarah shook her head, suppressing a smile. "All right, let's see what we're working with." She picked up the knife, sliced a carrot effortlessly, then handed it to him. "Try not to lose a finger." Thomas picked up the knife, feeling vaguely ridiculous. It wasn't that he had never cooked before, he just never had to. His meals were prepared, presented, and cleared away before he ever had to think about them. The first slice was uneven. The second one wasn't much better. Sarah hummed. "So you're bad at this?" Thomas exhaled, shaking his head. It's a carrot, not a business deal. Yet somehow you're struggling with it more. His lips quirked slightly despite himself. You're enjoying this, aren't you? A little. She grabbed a pan and set it on the stove, turning on the heat. Here, let me... She stepped beside him, her hands brushing his as she adjusted the knife in his grip. The movement was unthinking, casual. But Thomas stilled. It was subtle, but he noticed. The warmth of her skin, the way she smelled faintly of citrus and something soft, something clean. He wasn't sure why it caught him off guard. She didn't seem to notice, though. Like this, she said, guiding his hand slightly before stepping back. Thomas followed her instructions, more focused than necessary. By the time the vegetables were prepped, Sarah had cracked eggs into a bowl, whisking them effortlessly. You really do this every night? Thomas asked, watching her. Sarah shrugged. Most nights. Why? She glanced at him, as if the question surprised her. Then she went back to stirring. Because it's cheaper. Because I like knowing what's in my food. And because, honestly, she paused. I hate eating alone. Thomas was silent for a moment. He hadn't expected that. It wasn't said sadly, but it was honest. And for a reason he couldn't explain, it settled somewhere deep in his chest. Sarah poured the eggs into the pan, the soft sizzle filling the quiet. What about you? Thomas leaned against the counter. What about me? Do you cook? He let out a low chuckle. No. Sarah smirked. Figured. Thomas exhaled, watching as she stirred the food with quiet focus. I eat alone most nights too. Sarah glanced at him, a flicker of something in her expression. Then she simply nodded. Neither of them said anything after that. The meal was simple, just stir-fried vegetables and scrambled eggs over rice. But it was good. Leave a comment, sunshine, if you find this young couple adorable. Thomas sat across from her at the small wooden table, the space between them filled only by the sound of quiet eating. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten something that hadn't been prepared by a chef, something that wasn't plated like an art piece, arranged to be admired more than consumed. Sarah ate without pretense, one leg tucked under the other, completely at ease in her own space. Thomas found himself relaxing without realizing it. So, Sarah said between bites, what do you actually do? Thomas smirked slightly. You don't know? She shrugged. I assumed rich businessman, but I try not to make a habit of Googling people I meet in hospital waiting rooms. He chuckled. You assumed right. Vague. He smirked. On purpose. Sarah rolled her eyes. Fine. Keep your secrets then. For some reason, the teasing made something in his chest feel lighter. As they ate, the conversation drifted between small things. Sarah talking about how she had started her business. Thomas mentioning, briefly, the pressure of running one. They didn't pry into each other's lives, didn't force conversation. It was easy, and Thomas wasn't sure the last time he'd had easy. After they finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair, stretching slightly. Well, I'd say you survived dinner. Thomas smirked. You're saying that like it was a challenge. For a man who didn't know how to chop a carrot, it was. He huffed a quiet laugh. Then, after a beat, Can I have your number? Sarah raised a brow, leaning her elbow on the table. You asking because you actually want it? Or because you regret not getting it last time? He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Both. Sarah tilted her head, watching him for a moment. Then, slowly, she reached for her phone. All right, but don't use it to send me stock market updates. Thomas smirked, pulling out his own phone. Wouldn't dream of it. She typed in her number, then slid the phone back across the table. And just like that, the distance between them shifted. Thomas didn't fully understand why. But he knew one thing. He'd see her again. The first text came 2 days later. "Thomas, I still think you cheated at chopping vegetables." Sarah had stared at her phone for a moment, lips quirking before responding. "Sarah, and I still think you're too rich to hold a knife properly." That was how it started. What should have been a forgettable night, a one-time shared meal, had turned into something else entirely. Their conversations stretched longer, moving from late-night texts to coffee meetups to lazy afternoons spent in the small corners of the city where people didn't wear suits and time didn't feel so urgent. Sarah found herself growing accustomed to the way Thomas occupied space. Not just physically, but in her thoughts. He was sharp, quick-witted, always carrying himself with that effortless confidence that came from knowing the world bent for men like him. But with her, it was different. He was still guarded, still composed. But there were moments, small ones, where she saw something else, like when he watched her work at her stall, quietly observant as she crafted drinks with the same care he likely reserved for closing business deals. Or the way he never interrupted when she spoke, never dismissed her words as trivial. He listened, actually listened, even when she talked about things that had nothing to do with his world. And somewhere along the way, Thomas started letting her see pieces of him too. "Try it again." Thomas exhaled through his nose, leveling her with an unimpressed look. "It's literally just pouring liquid." Sarah smirked, arms crossed as she leaned against the counter. "And yet, you're doing it wrong." They were at her stall long after the fair had closed for the night. A dim street lamp cast shadows across the pavement, the scent of citrus and vanilla still lingering in the air. Thomas, sleeves rolled up, was holding a cocktail shaker with the kind of precision most people reserved for handling delicate machinery. Sarah huffed. "It's not a bomb, Thomas. I know that." "Then why are you shaking it like you're afraid it's going to explode?" He shot her a look, but didn't argue. Instead, he adjusted his grip and tried again. The ice rattled against the metal, the movement smoother this time. Sarah watched him, arms still folded. "Okay. That wasn't terrible." Thomas set the shaker down with an exaggerated flourish. "I live to impress." Sarah rolled her eyes but grinned. "I'll be honest, I didn't expect you to actually take me up on this." Thomas leaned against the counter. "And yet, here I am." She studied him for a moment. "Why?" His gaze didn't waver. "Why not?" Sarah shook her head, amused. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who likes getting his hands dirty." "I don't." She raised a brow. "And yet?" A beat of silence. Then, "You make it look easy." The words caught her off guard. Thomas wasn't someone who handed out compliments lightly, and the simplicity of it, the honesty, made her stomach flip unexpectedly. Sarah cleared her throat, looking away. "It's not that hard," he hummed. "Maybe not for you." The space between them shifted, charged with something neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. And it didn't stop there. Barbara noticed the change before Thomas did. She had been watching him for weeks, the way his expression softened at his phone, the way his absences became more frequent, but never urgent, never business-related. One evening, as they sat in the living room, she set down her tea and studied him carefully. "You met someone." Thomas didn't even glance up from his laptop. "I meet a lot of people." Barbara smiled knowingly. "Not like this." That made him pause. She tilted her head. "You're different lately. Lighter." Thomas sighed, shutting the laptop. "I don't know what you're talking about." Barbara's gaze was unwavering. "You do." He didn't respond, because she was right. It happened on a quiet evening, somewhere between conversation and comfortable silence. They were sitting on a park bench, the night air cool but not biting. The city lights blinking distantly beyond the trees. Sarah had just finished telling him about a customer who had tried to haggle over a $4 drink like it was a high-stakes negotiation. Thomas had listened, amusement flickering in his eyes, but he hadn't laughed. Not fully. And then, without planning, without thinking, he said it. "I don't know when it started," Thomas admitted, voice lower than usual, more certain. "But I can't stop thinking about you." Sarah blinked. She hadn't been expecting that. Not tonight. Not like this. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. Soft, disbelieving, shaking her head slightly. "Wow," she murmured. "That's direct." Thomas huffed a quiet breath, watching her reaction carefully. "Would you prefer I sugarcoat it?" Sarah bit her lip, her gaze flickering over his face. The amusement faded, replaced by something softer, something more careful. "No," she admitted, "I wouldn't." A pause, a heartbeat of hesitation. Then, finally, "Me too." Thomas exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding the breath for too long. Sarah smiled, nudging his shoulder playfully. "Now what?" His lips twitched. "I was hoping you'd tell me." She laughed again, shaking her head. "Guess we'll figure it out." And for the first time in a long time, Thomas wasn't in control. He wasn't leading, wasn't dictating, he was just falling. The estate loomed ahead, taller, grander, and more intimidating than Sarah had expected. From where she stood on the front steps, the house felt like something out of another world. One where marble floors never scuffed, chandeliers dripped with wealth, and time moved slower, cushioned by luxury. She adjusted the strap of her bag, suddenly aware of the way her sneakers scuffed against the pristine entryway. This was a bad idea. "I can literally hear you overthinking." Sarah shot a glance at Thomas, who stood beside her, looking as effortlessly composed as ever. Dressed in a crisp navy button-down, with his sleeves rolled up just enough to look relaxed, but still polished, he was the picture of control. She, in contrast, felt like she had just walked into the wrong movie set. "I'm not overthinking," she muttered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Thomas smirked, but didn't push. Instead, he reached for the front door and pushed it open. Sarah stepped inside and promptly forgot how to breathe. The inside was even more overwhelming. A grand staircase curved upward, leading to rooms she'd never see. The chandelier overhead cast golden light over everything, walls lined with paintings that probably cost more than she made in a year, furniture that looked like no one had ever actually sat on it. Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral. She was used to people with money, customers who wore watches worth more than her entire business, people who ordered drinks without checking prices. But this was different. Because now, it was personal. And then, Sarah. Barbara's voice was warm, and when Sarah turned, she saw the older woman approaching with a genuine smile. Barbara reached for her hands without hesitation, her touch light but familiar. "It's so good to see you again, dear. I never got the chance to thank you properly for what happened that night." Sarah blinked. "Oh, you don't have to." "I do." Barbara's expression softened. "I know things got tense, and I hate that I put you in that position. I'm truly sorry for what happened." Sarah wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this level of warmth. She nodded slowly, a small relieved smile pulling at her lips. "I'm just glad you're okay." Barbara squeezed her hands once before stepping back. "Come on, let's get you settled in. I hope you're hungry." Sarah exhaled quietly. "Okay." Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. And then, hope she doesn't mind the menu. A cool voice cut in. Wouldn't want any unexpected reactions. Sarah turned, already knowing who it was before she even saw her. Hayley. The woman stood near the dining room entrance, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but bordering on polite disinterest. She looked flawless, of course, impeccably dressed, not a hair out of place. But her eyes flicked over Sarah, like she was something misplaced in the house. Sarah didn't flinch at the jab, but she felt it. Barbara shot Hayley a look. That's enough. Hayley just shrugged. I'm just saying. Sarah inhaled through her nose, forcing a neutral expression. She had dealt with worse. She wasn't here for Hayley's approval. I can assure you, Sarah said, voice even, I always check the ingredients. Hayley's lips twitched slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite friendly, before she turned away, disappearing into the dining room. Sarah didn't move, but Thomas did. His posture tensed beside her, but instead of snapping at his sister, he glanced at Sarah, his eyes asking, Do you want me to handle this? Sarah just shook her head once. She could fight her own battles. Barbara sighed, but didn't push. Come, let's sit. The dinner table was ridiculously long, a full spread of dishes covering every inch. Sarah hesitated before settling into a seat beside Barbara, across from Hayley, who hadn't spoken since the initial remark. Thomas sat at the head of the table, watching everything unfold quietly. The meal started civilly enough. Barbara, true to her warm nature, engaged Sarah in conversation, asking about her business, her recipes, even throwing in the occasional story about how she used to experiment in the kitchen when Thomas and Hayley were kids. Sarah found herself relaxing, just slightly. She talked about her favorite ingredients, about how she had learned to mix drinks not from expensive schools, but from trial and error, from long hours of perfecting flavors that told stories instead of just tasting good. Barbara listened with genuine interest, nodding along, even sharing a few of her own experiences in cooking. And then, Hayley spoke again. So what's the plan? The table quieted slightly, attention shifting toward her. Sarah blinked. The plan? Hayley took a slow sip of her wine before setting the glass down. With my brother. You know, since you're suddenly at our dinner table. Barbara stiffened. Thomas exhaled sharply. Sarah? She just tilted her head slightly as if considering the question. No real plan, she said evenly. We just see where it goes. Hayley hummed, tapping her fingers against her glass. Right. And does that usually work for you? Barbara's jaw tightened. Hayley, I'm just asking, Hayley continued, voice smooth. It's just interesting, considering Thomas isn't exactly the type to... Hayley. Thomas's voice wasn't loud, but it held weight. His sister finally looked at him, her expression still unreadable. Sarah met Hayley's gaze, and for a second, just a brief one, there was something there. A challenge? A test? Sarah wasn't sure, but she didn't back down. She picked up her water glass, taking a slow sip before setting it down. You seem very invested. Hayley blinked. Excuse me? Sarah shrugged. In what Thomas does, who he spends time with. She gestured vaguely. Who he eats dinner with. Hayley's expression didn't shift, but something in her eyes flickered. Barbara, despite the tension, hid a small smile behind her napkin. Thomas, across the table, looked highly entertained. For the first time all night, Hayley didn't have a quick response. Sarah didn't push it, just went back to eating like the conversation had never happened. That night, after Sarah had gone, Thomas sat with Barbara in the living room, the air warm from the fireplace. She's special, Barbara said quietly, sipping her tea. She doesn't let things get to her, and she's not afraid of Haley. Thomas smirked. Few people are. Barbara smiled, but it was knowing. I like her. Thomas exhaled, leaning back against the couch, and then Barbara added, but Haley will take time. He knew that, but he also knew Sarah wasn't going anywhere. Haley sat in her office, the city skyline stretching out beyond the glass. The evening sun painted everything in a soft golden hue, but she wasn't paying attention to the view. Her fingers drummed against the desk, her thoughts tangled. Sarah. The woman had embedded herself into Thomas's life too quickly, too seamlessly. It was unnatural, suspicious. Haley had always known how to protect her family, how to filter the people who truly belonged from the ones who didn't. And Sarah, she didn't belong. It wasn't just about her job or where she lived. It was something else. Something unspoken that Haley couldn't shake. And so, against her better judgment, she had done something she had never needed to do before. She had looked into Sarah. It hadn't been hard. A few calls, some records, a tracked address. And now she knew exactly where to find her. The neighborhood was nothing like Haley expected. She had assumed small, modest. But this? It was rough, far removed from the world they lived in. The buildings were old, some windows cracked, sidewalks uneven. A few streetlights flickered, casting weak, unreliable light over the narrow roads. Haley stepped carefully, heels clicking against the pavement. She ignored the looks she got. Men sitting outside convenience stores, a group of teenagers smoking on a stoop. The stares lingered too long, their curiosity palpable. But Haley kept walking. She was here for one reason. Sarah. The address led her to a small, worn-down building, the kind of place where doors had too many locks and neighbors minded their own business. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping toward the entrance. Then she heard it. A low whistle. A voice, smooth and amused. Well, what do we have here? Haley stiffened. A group of men stood at the corner, their eyes lazy but sharp. One of them nudged another, murmuring something she didn't catch. Haley clenched her jaw, ignoring them as she stepped forward, but they didn't let her pass. Lost, sweetheart. The tallest one, broad-shouldered with a cocky smirk, stepped into her path. Haley's pulse kicked up. I don't have time for this, she said, voice even. Come on, another man grinned. No need to rush. The first one tilted his head, gaze trailing over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Fancy suit, expensive perfume. Yeah, you don't belong here. Haley lifted her chin. Move. But they only laughed. Maybe you need a little help finding your way. She knew this game, knew it too well. And just as she braced herself to either run or fight, something slammed into them. A drink cart. The wheels skidded against the pavement, knocking two of them back, sending cups and bottles clattering to the ground. What the hell? One of them snapped, staggering back. And then, move! Sarah's voice. Before Haley could react, a hand grabbed hers, strong, urgent. And suddenly, they were running. Sarah pulled her down a narrow alley, twisting through turns with the ease of someone who knew these streets, knew how to disappear. Haley didn't question it, didn't argue. She just ran. Footsteps pounded behind them, shouts cutting through the night. But Sarah never hesitated. She led them through another side street, ducked under a rusted gate, pulling Haley with her. And then, silence. Only their heavy breathing filled the empty lot. Sarah still had a grip on Haley's wrist, her fingers tight, her breath uneven. Haley yanked her hand free. What the hell was that? Sarah leaned against a wall, still catching her breath. You tell me. Haley glared. I came here to talk to you. Sarah let out a short laugh, running a hand through her hair. Yeah? And instead you almost got yourself mugged. Hayley crossed her arms, her heart still pounding. Sarah glanced at her, and despite the situation, despite everything, she smirked. I got to say, didn't peg you as the type to show up unannounced. Hayley exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I had questions. Sarah raised a brow. And you thought the best way to get answers was walking into this part of town. Hayley hated that she had a point. She looked away, her arms still crossed. Her pulse was finally slowing, but her pride was bruised. Sarah studied her for a moment before shaking her head with a chuckle. You're something else. Hayley didn't respond. Then, quieter. Now I get why my brother likes you. That made Sarah pause. She tilted her head, her usual smirk fading slightly. Hayley sighed, running a hand over her face. Look, I don't trust easily. And I especially don't trust people who walk into Thomas's life like it's effortless. Sarah's expression remained unreadable. Hayley exhaled, glancing at her. But tonight? You could have just let them have me. Sarah snorted. You think I'd let you get kidnapped? That'd be a terrible look for me. Hayley shook her head, half exasperated, half amused. You're impossible. Sarah grinned. So I've been told. A pause. Then, reluctantly, Hayley sighed. I may have been wrong about you. Sarah raised a brow. Wow. Was that an apology? Hayley huffed. Don't push it. Sarah chuckled, glancing back toward the now distant streets. Come on, let's get out of here. And for the first time since they had met, Hayley didn't hate the idea of following her lead. The curb was cold beneath Hayley, the rough pavement pressing through the fabric of her slacks. She exhaled, staring down at her hands, her breathing still uneven from the chase. Sarah sat beside her, stretching out her legs, like this was just another Tuesday. There was a cut on her palm from scraping it against a wall mid-run, but she didn't seem to care. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, I came here to tell you to leave my brother alone. Sarah glanced at her, raising a brow. That's so? Hayley nodded, running a hand through her hair, her voice flat. Yeah. Sarah hummed, tilting her head slightly. And now? Hayley let out a short, humorless laugh. Now, I'm wondering if you might be the only person who can keep up with him. Sarah smirked. High praise. Hayley shook her head, exhaling slowly. I don't like change. I don't like people walking into our lives like it's easy. And I especially don't like feeling like I don't have control over the situation. Sarah leaned back on her hands. I get that. Hayley glanced at her, skeptical. Sarah just shrugged. Control makes things feel safe, but life doesn't really care what we want, does it? Hayley scoffed, looking away. No, it doesn't. A pause. Then, I was unfair to you. Sarah didn't react right away, as if waiting for Hayley to take it back. But she didn't. Instead, Hayley met her gaze properly for the first time that night. I assumed the worst. I went looking for something to prove I was right about you. And maybe I just didn't want to be wrong. Sarah studied her for a moment before offering a small smile. That was almost an actual apology. Hayley rolled her eyes. Don't push it. Sarah chuckled, standing up and brushing off her jeans. She offered a hand, and after a brief hesitation, Hayley took it. They walked back in silence, but it wasn't tense, it wasn't forced, and for the first time, Hayley wasn't looking at Sarah like an outsider. The next time Sarah visited, it wasn't for Thomas, it was for Hayley. The invitation had been begrudging at best, a text message sent in a clipped, almost robotic tone. If you're free this weekend, come by. Sarah had nearly laughed at how forced it sounded, but she had responded with a simple, sure. And so, here she was. Barbara greeted her warmly at the door, as if she'd already expected her to show up. Haley, on the other hand, looked mildly like she regretted the decision. Sarah smirked, stepping inside. You look thrilled to see me. Haley crossed her arms. Let's just get this over with. Sarah followed her into the massive kitchen, where the counters were already lined with ingredients. I don't bake, Haley announced as if she were admitting a deep character flaw. Sarah leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Never. Haley shook her head. I don't cook either. Sarah whistled lowly. And yet somehow, you still survived adulthood. Privilege, Haley deadpanned. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. All right, let's start small. Haley watched as Sarah effortlessly measured out flour, cracked eggs and mixed batter with an ease that made it look natural. It was almost annoying how simple she made it seem. This doesn't look that hard, Haley muttered, peering into the bowl. Sarah grinned. That's the spirit. The first attempt was a disaster. Flour ended up in Haley's hair, the batter was too thick, and at one point, Haley nearly dropped the entire bowl. Sarah laughed so hard, she had to sit down. Barbara peeked in from the hallway, raising a brow. I haven't heard that much noise in here in years. Haley scowled. I think I hate baking. Sarah, still grinning, nudged her with her elbow. That's because you're bad at it. Haley huffed, but didn't argue. And by the time the second attempt actually looked edible, she let out a small, unintentional smile. Thomas arrived just as the first batch came out of the oven. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight of Haley covered in flour, Sarah smirking beside her, and actual baked goods on the counter. He blinked. Did I walk into an alternate universe? Sarah laughed. She baked. Can you believe it? Haley scowled. Barely. Barbara, watching from the dining table, smiled over her cup of tea. I told you she was special, she murmured to Thomas. He didn't respond right away. He just watched the way Haley rolled her eyes, but didn't actually seem mad. The way Sarah nudged her playfully, the way the kitchen felt alive in a way it hadn't before. And Thomas, he felt it too. This was what family was supposed to feel like. And somehow, against all odds, Sarah had become part of it. Sarah hadn't expected to fit. Not in this house. Not in this family. And yet here she was, somehow belonging without having tried to. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked pastries, Haley wiping a streak of flour off her cheek with a grumble, while Barbara casually flipped through an old recipe book at the table. The air was warm, filled with an ease that hadn't been there before. And Thomas. He leaned against the counter, watching it all unfold with something close to wonder. Sarah met his gaze across the room, raising a brow. You okay? Thomas blinked, shaking his head slightly, as if snapping out of something. Yeah, she smirked. You look weirdly sentimental. I am not sentimental, he said immediately. Barbara chuckled. Oh, sweetheart, you absolutely are. Sarah laughed, while Haley, still pretending to be indifferent, muttered, If this turns into a family hug moment, I'm leaving. But the thing was, it did feel like family, and Sarah wasn't sure when that happened. Later that evening, when it was just the two of them, Thomas finally let the walls slip. They sat outside on the patio, the evening breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Sarah pulled her knees up, resting her chin on them, watching the sky fade into darker shades. Thomas sat beside her, quieter than usual, lost in thought. Sarah nudged him lightly. You're thinking too hard again. He exhaled. I do that a lot. She smirked. I've noticed. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, just filled with things unsaid. Then, finally, "My father wasn't like my mother," Thomas murmured. Sarah turned her head slightly, listening. He wasn't warm. He wasn't kind. He was precise, calculated. His fingers tapped against the armrest absently. He had expectations. You meet them, or you fail. Sarah stayed quiet, letting him talk. Thomas's lips pressed together. Haley and I learned that early. We were never just kids. We were investments. Sarah's chest tightened at that. Barbara tried to balance it out, he continued. She made the house feel like a home, gave us something softer to hold on to. But even then, he exhaled, shaking his head. It's not easy to forget what you're raised to believe. Sarah's voice was softer than usual when she spoke. And what was that? Thomas looked at her then. That people only stay if they have something to gain. Sarah held his gaze, and suddenly it made sense. Why he had been so careful, so distant at first. Why he'd taken so long to let her in. Because Thomas had spent his life learning not to trust easy connections. And yet, here he was, trusting her anyway. Sarah reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against his, not forcing anything, just reminding him she was here. I'm not here because of what I can get, she murmured. Thomas studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his fingers curled around hers. I know. And for Thomas, that was everything. Barbara saw it first, the way her son changed. The tension in his shoulders wasn't as tight, his smiles weren't as reserved. And when he looked at Sarah, when he looked at Sarah, there was something in his expression she had never seen before. Ease, peace, love. She didn't question it, didn't doubt it. She just took Sarah's hands one afternoon in the kitchen, squeezing them gently, and said, I'm glad you found each other. Sarah's throat tightened unexpectedly, and when Barbara pulled her into a hug, Sarah let her. The river shimmered under the soft glow of the city lights, its surface rippling gently as a cool breeze passed through. The distant hum of life, cars rolling by, the muffled chatter of people walking past, blurred into the background, leaving just the two of them in their own quiet world. Thomas walked beside Sarah, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. The night was peaceful, the air crisp with the faint scent of autumn creeping in. Sarah glanced at him, noting the quiet tension in his posture. She nudged him lightly with her shoulder. You're thinking too hard again. He exhaled, a small smirk playing at his lips. Seems to be a habit. She laughed softly. Yeah, and I'm still waiting for you to break it. Thomas stopped walking. Sarah took a step forward before realizing he had paused. She turned back, eyebrows furrowed. What? Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel uncertain. I love you. The words weren't rushed. They weren't desperate or spoken out of obligation. They were steady, sure, the simplest truth he had ever known. Sarah blinked. For a second, she just stared at him, as if processing. Then slowly, a smile curved her lips. Not surprised, not hesitant, but warm. She stepped closer, cupping his face in her hands, her fingers tracing lightly over the sharp lines of his jaw. And then, in a voice just above a whisper, she said, I know. Thomas let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and an exhale of relief. Sarah grinned. I was kind of waiting for you to catch up. He huffed, shaking his head, but he didn't pull away. She pressed her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the cool night air. I love you too. His hands found her waist, pulling her in gently, as if anchoring himself to this moment. No lavish gestures, no grand confessions. Just them, And for the first time, Thomas understood. Home wasn't walls or wealth or status. It was this. It was her. And their story. It was just beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.